Good morning, everyone. My name is Gonzalo Ferreira. I am a Dairy Management Extension Specialist from the Department of Dairy Science at Virginia Tech, and I will present alternative forages for dairy farming systems. Before starting, I want to thank Dr. Jackie Borman from Purdue University for inviting me to present this topic. The objective of this presentation is to provide a different perspective about the use of alternative forages in dairy farming systems. As a starting point, I want to start defining alternative forages. After all, what is an alternative forage? Does a definition of alternative forage actually exist? To be honest, I've been trying to find a definition and I have failed finding one. Also, the word alternative implies alternative to something else. So the next question is alternative to what? Finally, why do we need alternative forages? To me, any forage can be considered an alternative forage. This picture here shows a group of lactating dairy cows grazing a soybean crop during the summer season in Argentina. In this context, soybeans became an alternative forage to alfalfa, a typical forage source during the summer months in Argentina. My message here is that any forage can be considered an alternative forage. Having provided my own definition of alternative forages, I can now disclose that I will speak about some forages alternative to the most popular forages utilized in the US for dairy cattle. Those are corn and alfalfa. For many reasons, we call corn and alfalfa the king and the queen of forages, right? Why do we need alternative forages? The reasons for this are multiple and diverse. If a farmer wants to maximize the use of the land, then he or she might need to feed alternative different forages as they fit in the rotation. Also, in areas of heat or drought stress, some forages might fit better than others. Another reason can be lowering input cost, given that some crops are cheaper to grow than others. And finally, alternative forages might be needed based on the nutritional needs of the dairy farming system. Everything I just said leads me to the definition of the best forage. I have two perspectives when defining the best forage. With a financial and nutritional perspective, I define the best forage as the one that allows me to formulate the cheapest diet while covering the requirements of the animal. With an agronomic and logistic perspective, I define the best forage as the one I can grow according to the environment, for example, the soil and the weather, or the one that I can obtain according to my location. So far, I spent a few slides defining alternative forages. Now, I am going to show you some data about the use of forages, alternative forages, to corn and alfalfa. I am not going to disagree that corn and alfalfa are the best forages. However, I want to see how big of a difference makes the use of alternative forages in dairy cattle systems. I will start showing how big of a difference made feeding sorghum silage instead of corn silage to high producing dairy cows. And for that, I will start with the following misconception, and that is that sorghum silage is not adequate for feeding high-producing dairy cows. At the end, we know that silage is king, right? But is sorghum silage that bad for high-producing dairy cows? To address this, we performed a study a few years ago in which we fed corn silage-based diets and sorghum silage-based diets to high-producing dairy cows. This table here shows the nutritional composition of the silages. We have corn silage on the left and sorghum silage on the right. We can see that the dry matter concentration was similar, 33 and 34% dry matter. Crude protein in both cases was about 7%. Neutral detergent fiber was quite different between the corn silage with 36% and sorghum silage 49%. So here, big difference. Starch concentration was not that different, 29% for sorghum silage and 31% for corn silage. And non-fiber carbohydrates, yes, it was quite different, with 34% for sorghum silage and 46% for corn silage. In this study, we used both silages at the same inclusion rate, which was 33% of the total dry matter. Then we kept all the other concentrates in the same proportions in both diets. The resulting diets contained similar concentrations of ash and crude protein. However, they had a slightly different concentration of neutral detergent fiber, or NDF, being a little greater for the sorghum silage diet. Also, there was a slight difference in the starch concentration of the diets, being slightly greater for the corn silage diet. And then also this resulted in a greater concentration of non-fiber carbohydrates for the corn silage diet, 44% and 29% for corn silage and sorghum silage respectively. In this slide, the figure from the left shows the production of the milk production. On the y-axis is represented the milk yield in pounds per day. As we can see, the cows consuming the corn silage diet produce 114 pounds per day, and the cows consuming the sorghum silage based diet produce 108, which was statistically different and lower than the corn silage diet. However, the important thing here is that high producing cows could perform decently well consuming sorghum silage diets. It's not that you're going to feed sorghum silage diets and the cows are not going to perform decently well. The figure from the right shows the dry matter intake. On the y-axis, we have the dry matter intake on pounds per day. As we can see, cows consuming the sorghum silage diet consume 56 pounds per day of dry matter, and the cows consuming corn silage diet, they consume 63 pounds per day of dry matter. So dry matter was significantly lower for the cows consuming the sorghum silage diets. An interesting observation of this study was that the milk from cows consuming the sorghum silage had 3.84% fat in milk, and the milk from cows consuming the corn silage diet had only 3.3% fat in the milk. Looking to the milk fat yield, which is in the figure from the right, cows consuming sorghum silage ended producing more fat than cows consuming the corn silage diet. The increase in milk fat yield has some interesting economic implications. For regions like in the Mid-Atlantic or in the southern US, where the milk price is determined by fat mainly, the increase in milk fat concentration would have resulted in more revenue for cows consuming sorghum silage than for cows consuming corn silage diets. This is an article I published a few years ago in which I used the data that I just showed you. When we value the milk that was produced by these cows, the revenue for cows consuming corn silage was $16.8 per day, whereas the revenue of cows consuming the sorghum silage was $17.5 per day. So at the end, when you put all the pieces together, again, in regions where they only pay based on fat, feeding sorghum silage may have resulted in greater income over feed costs than cows consuming the corn silage diets. The story is totally different in regions where the milk price is determined by both fat and protein. In this study, there was no difference in the concentration of protein in milk. It was similar with the corn silage diets and the sorghum silage diets. And therefore, because there was a lower production of milk with the sorghum silage diet, the yield of milk protein was lower for the sorghum silage diet. Therefore, in regions where the price of the milk is heavily determined by the protein concentration, maybe in this case is not as beneficial the use of the sorghum silage. Now I'm going to change a little the perspective, and I will discuss another misconception which is related to the input costs of the alternative forage. This misconception is that farmers will spend less money feeding sorghum silage than feeding corn silage to dairy cows. Let's see what you think after discussing the next slides. The numbers I will show you now in the next slides are a little bit outdated, but they are still useful to make the point I want to make. Generally speaking, corn seed is much more expensive than sorghum seed. A few years ago, for example, the farmer needed to spend $80 per acre for seeding corn, or alternatively $20 per acre to seed sorghum. Looking to these numbers only, seeding sorghum for forage is much more appealing than seeding corn. But then the question is, why do we typically plant corn instead of sorghum? And that is related to the information presented in the next slides. In this figure, there is a summary from a study that we did a few years ago for corn, which is represented in the blue columns, and then we have forage sorghum and sorghum Sudan. And on the y-axis of this figure, we have the dry mature yield in tons per acre, and these crops were planted in both the spring and the summer seasons in Florida. The information from this figure, what it says is that there was a statistically significant difference in the dry mature yield for corn and the sorghum species. Okay, so the message here is that corn yields more than sorghum. Or if you want to say it in another way, is that sorghum does not necessarily yield more than corn. In this table, I put most of the inputs needed to grow corn or sorghum for silage. We can see here we have the seed cost, the fertilizer, the chemicals, planting and spraying, and the chopping, holing, and ensiling, all in dollars per acre. I also put a buffer here of other expenses of $15 per acre. As I mentioned before, the cost in seed is much greater for corn than for sorghum. I also put here a greater cost on fertilizer and also on chemicals, and the same for planting and spraying. I put a slightly greater cost of chopping for the sorghum, and at the end here in this red line we have the total cost in dollars per acre. After all, planting corn for silage costs $602 and planting sorghum for silage $507 per acre. Then, based on the data I showed to you in the previous slide with the tonnage, we had a slight difference in the tonnage. This is corrected to 35% dry matter. And finally, we have the final cost of the silage on dollars per ton on an as-fed basis. After all, despite the difference in the dollars per acre, when we divide that by the tonnage that we have per acre, the difference in the silage is not that great. The sorghum silage is $18.8 per ton and the corn silage $20.8 per ton. Also, comparing corn silage with sorghum silage is like comparing apples and oranges. This table summarizes the nutritional composition of several corn and sorghum silages. We can see in this table that sorghum silage typically has a greater concentration of neutral detergent fiber, or NDF, and a lower concentration of starch than corn silage. Also, we can see here that the digestibility of the fiber is lower for sorghum silage than for corn silage. Why is this important? Well, in this slide, I'm showing an output of a ration formulation software in which we put all this information together. So we put different ingredients, including corn silage and sorghum silage. We included the cost of the silages. Remember I mentioned the 20.8 for corn silage and 18.8 for the sorghum silage. We also put the composition of the different ingredients, and as I told you in the previous slide, sorghum silage typically has a greater concentration of fiber and a lower concentration of starch than corn silage. And then we performed a least cost formulation approach to provide the cheapest diet possible while meeting the requirements of the cow. In this case, if you can see here, sorghum silage, the inclusion is 0. So for the ration formulation, what we did is we mandated the exclusion of sorghum silage in this diet, and we wanted to include only corn silage. In this case, the resulting diet, the cost of the resulting diet was $4.05 per cow per day. However, if we do the same approach, but now we say let's exclude the corn silage and let's allow the sorghum silage to be included in the diet. Again, the output provides you a diet that meets the requirements of the animal, but in this case, the cost of the diet is $4.84 per cow per day, which is more expensive than the previous diet. So, what happened in this exercise? Yes, when we see only the silage cost, by using corn silage, we are spending 82 cents per cow per day. However, when we use sorghum silage, we use much less money. We spend only 39 cents per cow per day. And when we see this perspective only, it is tempting to say that we are going to spend less money using sorghum silage. However, when we see the cost of the whole ration, at the end, with the corn silage, we spent $4.05 per cow per day, and with the sorghum silage, we end up spending $4.84 per cow per day. So at the end, we are spending more on the feeding program when we use sorghum silage than when we use corn silage. A few years ago, we presented an abstract about this topic, and the conclusion that my student arrived was that assuming an equal milk production with the two diets, sorghum silage has to be 30% cheaper, and I'm talking here in dollars per ton, than corn silage to actually increase income over feed costs. So again, when you see the whole picture, maybe sorghum silage does not result in a cheaper feeding program. Now I'm going to discuss the use of grass hay as an alternative forage to alfalfa hay. And again, I will use the misconception as a guide here that says that mixed grass hay is not adequate for feeding high-producing dairy cows. To address this, we performed another study a few years ago in which we formulated rations including alfalfa hay or grass hay in the diets for high-producing dairy cows. In this table, we see the nutritional composition of the hays, and in this case, both they had about 88% dry matter. Ash was slightly higher for the alfalfa hay than for the grass hay. Crude protein, it was 2 times greater for the alfalfa hay than for the grass hay, and that makes sense. And also the NDF concentration was substantially greater for the grass hay, 75%, than for the alfalfa hay. Then the other differences are kind of minor. Sugars 5% versus 2.5%, and then starch about 2%. As I said before in the previous example, we formulated diets using a least cost formulation approach. So here what we were trying to do is getting diets that meet the requirements of the cows, including alfalfa hay or grass hay. The alfalfa hay diet in this case ended up having less hay than the grass hay, 14% and 19%. And also the alfalfa hay diet, because alfalfa has had a much lower concentration of fiber, we ended adding some soy hulls to replace that fiber. In this table, we can see the nutritional composition of the two diets, and ash was similar among diets with the alfalfa hay and the grass hay diet, the same with the crude protein. The neutral detergent fiber was slightly higher for the grass hay diet than for the alfalfa hay diet, and also the starch concentration was slightly higher for the grass hay diet than for the alfalfa hay diet. Going to the results of this study, the figure from the left shows the milk yield, and as we here on the y-axis is represented the milk yield in pounds per day. And as you can see here, cows consuming the alfalfa based diet produce 102 pounds per cow per day, and then cows consuming the grass-based diets produce 97 pounds per cow per day. So a slightly lower production for the cows consuming the grass hay. This difference was statistically significant, but still cows were able to produce decent amount of milk consuming the grass hay diet. In the case of dry matter intake, also we have seen a decrease in dry matter intake for those cows consuming the grass hay diets. An interesting observation of this study was that the milk from cows consuming the grass hay diets had 4.49% of fat in the milk, whereas the cows consuming the alfalfa hay diets had 4.22% fat in the milk, and this difference was statistically significant. Looking to the milk fat yield at the end, there were no differences in the production of fat. Again, that can have an implication on the milk pricing. Now, looking to the concentration of milk protein, also there were no differences here, and after all, because of the lower milk production, there was a lower yield of milk protein in cows consuming the grass hay diets. So again, going back to that comment from the sorghum study, in areas where milk price is determined only by fat concentration, maybe this approach is beneficial. In those areas where the milk price is determined by protein, maybe this is not the best approach. So we're approaching the end of the presentation, and now we're going to discuss my last topic, which is going to be related to the use of BMR genotypes in summer annual grasses. In this case, I want to address the misconception that brown midrib forages, or BMR forages, have the greatest fiber digestibility. Why are we interested in this? Well, BMR forages are associated with a reduction in the synthesis of lignin. Because lignin is a major determinant of fiber digestibility, it is expected that BMR forages would have lower lignin concentration and greater fiber digestibility. The thing is that in the sorghum study that I showed to you a few slides before, the BMR sorghum that we used had a greater concentration of lignin in the fiber than the conventional corn silage that we use in that study. So that triggered to us the question of whether BMR forages have greater digestibility within species, but not necessarily among species. So recently we have done a plot study in which we planted 4 varieties of corn, 4 varieties of sorghum, and 4 varieties of pearl millet. For each of the 3 species, 2 of the varieties were BMR and 2 of the varieties were non-BMR. Then, after harvesting, we performed an in situ digestion kinetic study to compare the fiber digestion kinetics. And in this figure, I will show you the results. First, this line represents the digestibility of the fiber of conventional corn. Then the red line represents the digestibility of the fiber, and again this is all on an NDF basis. So of 100 units of NDF, how much was digested after the fermentation? We can see that the conventional sorghum had a lower NDF digestion than the conventional corn. And a similar pattern was observed for conventional per millet. Now let's see what happened with the BMR genotypes. This thinner line, orange line, represents the digestion of BMR corn, and we can see that was greater than the digestion of fiber for conventional corn. Now if we see the digestion of the fiber for the BMR sorghum, it is represented here in this line, and at the end the digestion of the fiber for the BMR sorghum was lower than the digestion of the fiber of the BMR corn, which is here, but it was similar to the digestion of the fiber of the conventional corn. And the same was observed for the digestion of the fiber of the BMR per millet. So the conclusions of this study were that, yes, BMR has a greater fiber digestibility when comparing within species, but when we compare among species, that an alternative forage has the BMR mutation does not mean that it's going to have the greatest NDF digestibility. So we arrived to the end of my presentation, and I want to close stressing two things. First, that the use of alternative forages will likely depend on the needs of the farm, and at the end, any forage can be considered adequate based on those needs. Therefore, we should not build walls assuming that we cannot use certain alternative forages for high producing dairy cows. The second message I want to stress is the concept of alternative forage management. For example, in areas where heat or drought stress can affect the growth of the corn, maybe we can still use corn, changing the cycle of the corn, the planting date of the corn, or maybe using some irrigation. Okay, so again, it's not only about finding alternative forages, also it's about finding alternative forage management. With that, I thank you all for your attention, and if you have any questions, here you have my information to contact me. Thank you again, and have a great rest of the day.